Chapter 44. Vadis. Light from the burning city filled the sky as far as a human eye could reach. The moon rose large and full from behind the mountains, and inflamed at once by the glare took on the color of the heated brass. It seems to look with amazing with amazement on the world ruling city which was perishing. In the rose colored abysses of heaven rose colored stars were glittering. But in distinction from usual nights, the earth was brighter than the heavens. Rome, like a giant pile, illuminated the whole Campania. In the bloody light were seen distant mountains, towns, villas, temples, mountains, and the aqueducts stretching toward the city from all the adjacent hills. On the aqueducts were swarms of people who had gathered there for safety or to gaze at the burning. Meanwhile, the dreadful element was embracing new divisions of the city. It was impossible to doubt that the criminal hands were spreading the fire, since new conflagrations were breaking out all the time in places remote from the principal fire. From the heights on which Rome was founded, the flames flowed like waves of the sea into the valleys densely occupied by houses of 5 or 6 stories, full of shops, booths, movable wooden amphitheaters, built to accommodate various spectacles, and finally storehouses of wood, olives, grain, nuts, pine cones, the kernels of which nourished the more needly population, and clothing, which through Caesar's favor was distributed from time to time among the rabble huddled into narrow alleys. In those places the fire, finding abundance of inflammable materials, became almost a series of explosions and took possession of whole streets with unheard of rapidity. People encamping outside the city or standing on the aqueducts knew from the color of the flame and what was burning. The furious power of the wind carried out forth from the fiery gulf thousands and millions of burning shells of walnuts and almonds, which shooting suddenly into the sky like countless flocks of bright butterflies, burst with a cracking or driven by the wind fell in other parts of the city, on aqueducts and fields beyond Rome. All thought of rescue seemed out of place. Confusion increased every moment, for one side of the population of the city was fleeing through every gate to places outside. On the other, the fire had lured in thousands of people from the neighborhood, such as dwellers in small towns, peasants, and half-wild shepherds of the Campania, brought in by hope of plunder. The shout, "Rome is perishing," did not leave the lips of the crowd. The ruin of the city seemed at the time to end every rule and loosen all bounds which hitherto had joined people in a single integrity. The mob, in which slaves were more numerous, cared nothing for the lordship of Rome. Destruction of the city could only free them, hence here and there they assumed a threatening attitude. Violence and robbery were extended. It seems that only the spectacle of the perishing city arrested attention and restrained for the moment an outburst of slaughter which will begin as soon as the city was turned into ruins. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, forgetting that Rome, besides temples and walls, possessed some tens of legions in all parts of the world, appeared merely waiting for a watchword and a leader. People began to mention the name Spartacus, but Spartacus was not alive. Meanwhile, citizens assembled and armed themselves, each with what he could. The most monstrous reports were currently at all gates. Some declared that Vulcan, commanded by Jupiter, was destroying the city with fire from beneath the earth. Others that Vesta was taking vengeance for Rubria. People with these convictions did not care to say anything, but beseeching the temples implored mercy from the gods. It was it was prepared most generally, however, that Caesar had given command to burn Rome, so as to free himself from others which rose from the Subura, and build a new city under the name of Neronia. Rage seized the populace of thought of this, and if, as Vinicius believed, a leader had taken advantage of that outburst of hatred, Nero's hour will have struck whole years before it did. It was said also that Caesar had gone mad, that he will command praetorians and gladiators to fall upon the people and make a general slaughter. Or others swore by the gods that wild beasts had been led out of the vivaria at bronze spears' command. Men had seen on the street lions with burning manes, and mad elephants and bisons trampling down people in crowds. There was even some truth in this, for in certain places elephants, at sight of the approaching fire, had burst the vivaria, and gaining their freedom, rushed away from the fire in wild fright, destroying everything before them like a tempest. Public report estimated at tens of thousands of number of persons who had perished in the conflagration. In truth, a great number had perished. There were people who, losing all their property, or those dearest their hearts, threw themselves willingly into the flames from despair. Others were suffocated by smoke in the middle of the city, between the Capitol on one side and the Quirinal and the Viminal and the Esquiline on the other, as also between the Palatine and the Celian Hill. Where the streets were most densely occupied, the fire began in so many places at once that the whole crowds of people were fleeing in one direction, struck unexpectedly on a new wall of fire in front of them, and died a dreadful death in a deluge of flame. In terror, in distraction, in bewilderment, people knew not where to flee. The streets were obstructed with goods, and many narrow places were simply closed. Those who took refuge in those markets and squares of the city where Flavian amphitheaters stood afterward, near the Temple of the Earth, near the Portico of Silvia, and higher up at the Temple of Juno and Lucinia, between the Clivius Birbius and the old Esquiline gate, perished from heat, surrounded by the sea of fire. In places not reached by the flames were found afterward hundreds of bodies burned to a crisp, though here and there unfortunates store up flat stones and have buried themselves in defense against the heat. Hardly a family inhabiting the center of the city survived in full, hence along the walls, all the gates, on all the roads, were heard howls of despairing women, calling on the dear names of those who have perished in the throng or the fire. And so, while some imploring the gods, others blaspheme them because this is awful catastrophe, all men were seen coming from the temple of Jupiter Liberator, stretching from their hands and crying, "If thou be a liberator, save thy altars in the city." But despair turned mainly against the old Roman gods, who in the minds of the populace were bound to watch over the city more carefully than others. They had proved themselves powerless, hence were insulted. On the other hand, it happened on the Via Asinaria that when a company of Egyptian priests appeared conducting a statue of Isis, which they have saved from the temple of Portia Caelimontana, a crowd of people pushed among the priests, attached themselves to the chariot, which they drew to the Appian gate, and seizing the statue, placed it on the temple of Mars, overwhelming the priests of the deity who dared to resist them. In other places, people invoked Serapis, Baal, or Jehovah, whose adherents, swarming out of the alleys in the neighborhood of the Subura and the Transtiber, filled with shouts and uproar the fields near the walls. In their cries were heard tones as if of triumph. When therefore some of the citizens joined the chorus and glorified the Lord of the world, others, indignant at this shouting, strove to repress it by violence. Here and there hymns were heard, sung by men in the bloom of life, by old men, by women and children, hymns wonderful and solemn, whose meaning they understood not, but in which we repeated from moment to moment the words, "Behold, the Judge cometh in the day of wrath and disaster." Thus this deluge of restless and sleepless people encircled the burning city like tempest-driven sea. But neither despair nor blasphemy nor hymn helped in any way. The destruction seemed irresistible, perfect, and pitiless as predestination itself. Around Pompey's amphitheater, stores of hemp caught fire, and ropes used in circuses, arenas, and every kind of machine at the games, and with them the adjoining buildings containing barrels of pitch in which ropes were smeared. In a few hours, all that part of the city beyond which lay the Campus Martius was so lighted by bright yellow flames that for a time it seems to the spectators, only half conscious from terror, that in that general ruin the other of night and day had been lost, and they were looking at sunshine. But later monstrous bloody gleam extinguished in all other colors of flame. From the sea of fire shot up the heated sky, gigantic fountains and pillars of flame spreading at the summits into fiery branches and feathers. Then the wind bore them away, turned them into golden threads, into hair, into sparks, and swept them over the Campagna, over the Alban hills. The night became brighter, the air itself seemed penetrated, not only with light, but with flame. The Tiber flowed on as living fire. The hapless city was turned into one pandemonium. The conflagration sized more and more space, took hills by storm, floated level places, drowning valleys, raged road and thunder.